Russians are bold and Australian gold. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is February 22nd, 2021. And on this date in history, in 1980, the U.S. Hockey team, the U.S. Olympic hockey team, beat the Russian Olympic hockey team at the height of the Cold War. And it was such a great moment in Olympic history. I think we all remember where we were on that day. Yeah, none of you were born. Still happened. Still pretty great. There's a movie called Miracle. Should check it out. So, the Dreyfus Affair. Now, if anyone's familiar with Richard Dreyfuss from the great movie Jaws, this is his great great grandfather. Alfred Dreyfus is found guilty on the on for treason. There wasn't really any good evidence, and a lot of it pointed to one of the other guys that he worked with. But despite this, he was convicted, and a lot of people thought it was because of anti-Semitism. So, anti Semitism, just in case you're not familiar with it, is a hatred of the Jews. As a result of this treason, he was sent to Devil's Island. But the public put a lot of pressure on the French government to pardon him. And one of the person that actually committed the treason was a Catholic officer. But they never went after him. And as a result of what happens with Dreyfus, the lack of a conviction on the Catholic officer, France will break with the Catholic Church with the separation of church and state in 1905. So, despite the fact they had just, in the last 40 to 50 years, re-merged with the Catholic Church, they broke again as a result of anti-Semitism and lack of government action against, someone who was guilty versus someone who was innocent. So the German Constitution. So we're back to Germany at this point, okay, which for all intent purposes was probably more Prussian than German because it was controlled by the German Prussian state. It has a two-house legislature. Now the lower house was elected by universal male suffrage, and this group was called the Reichstag. The other group was from the nobility. By the way, this is the same Reichstag that was in power whenever Hitler was in power. The emperor is in charge of all of the armed forces, the government, and all foreign policy. By the efforts of William II, or Wilhelm II if you would prefer, Germany's industry expanded. Their cities grew in democracy. The demand for democracy also increased. Just like the rest of the world, people crammed in these cities as fast as they could. The cities couldn't handle it, and a lot of people lived in really poor conditions in slums. Conservatives, again, remember, conservatives generally in history are people that are against change. They were against this whole concept of democracy, and they thought the best way to get away from going and changing was to have some type of invasion or war. Austria-Hungary. Now, again, the Austrians really are Germans. They just are from a German kingdom called Austria. Uh, they have universal male suffrage in 1907, and this led many minority groups within Austria-Hungary to demand the same. Okay, you had Serbs, you had Croatians, you had Bosnians, Austrians, Hungarians, Germans, Bohemians, Galicians, some Romanians, and several other Albanians. Several other groups were in Austria-Hungary at the time, but the only people that really had any power were the Austrians and the Hungarians. And the prime ministers would rule without parliament support. This is going to cause some major problems. Now, the Russo-Japanese War. Russia wanted some warm water ports in Manchuria, China, and in Korea. Japan also wanted these same ports, So before Russia could mobilize, they declared war on them, and they won a massive battle against the Russian Baltic Fleet in the Tsushima Strait. And once they won this major battle, before Russia could even get mobilized, they called for Teddy Roosevelt to negotiate a treaty between Russia and Japan. And as a result of this treaty, Teddy Roosevelt will win the Nobel Peace Prize. For any of you who aren't familiar with the Nobel Peace Prize, it's given to the person that does the most to generate peace in a given year. It was the Nobel family is actually the family that developed dynamite. And whenever he found that it wasn't being used for mining as he intended, and instead for the deaths of soldiers, he took all of the money he made off of it and donated it to create a prize to push for peace and advancements in the sciences. So, thank you, Mr. Nobel. Russian Tsar Nicholas II. By the way, he's going to be the last of the line, the Romanov family. He was an absolute ruler, and under his leadership or dictatorship, however you want to call it, it wasn't a dictatorship. He was an emperor. Russia becomes the fourth largest producer of steel, and that's more because of the work of Minister of Finance Sergei Witt. Okay, and the construction of the Trans-Siberians Railroad. By the way, the Trans-Siberian Railroad was built by a lot of the people that built the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. Since they'd already had the skills to do that, they hired some of the foremen to go and build a railroad all the way across Siberia. Now, workers were not treated well in Russia, and in 1905, they went to the palace to present a petition against the shortage of food after the war with Japan. So all they did was present a petition, and Nicholas II called out his royal guard to go and get the petitioners off of his property, and they killed hundreds of people. That was called Bloody Sunday. As a result of this action, Nicholas II was forced to create what was called the Duma or Parliament in Russia. Although he created them to try and get everyone off of his back, he completely ignored them once they were created. Now, once he is removed from power in 1917, they will actually be the ones that run the government for about 7 months before the Russian Revolution throws them out of power as well. Okay, so the United States had been in existence for about 120 years by the beginning of the 20th century. And it was quickly becoming one of the industrial leaders of the world. There's, just like with Russia and to a certain extent with Germany, there was a large amount of natural resources to be tapped, and it made it easier for them to become an industrial power. Also, you had a very large population. 40% of the population of the United States in 1900 was urban, and 80% of them were immigrants who were working very cheap. 9% of the population of the United States owned 71% of the wealth. Now, some of the things that slowed down some of the profit, although you still have a very small group that makes all the money, states passed laws to limit the amount of hours that people worked, working conditions for women and children, and once Teddy Roosevelt takes over in 1901 after the assassination of McKinley, antitrust laws broke up large corporations, and eventually Wilson will enact a federal income tax. By the way, the workplace was very dangerous. In 1905, you had something like 40,000 people die on the job, and 600,000 people get severely injured where they were maimed or permanently incapacitated or severely injured to the point where they were not capable of going back to work for months. Canadian growth. Canada grew with Manitoba and British Columbia. So, in the beginning, Canada was not the Canada that you know now. Most of the central part of Canada was completely unpopulated. And most of the northern part of Canada was also unpopulated just because of the severe cold weather. I know living in Texas, we can't understand what cold weather is. They did stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, Wilfrid Laurier was a prime minister who was able to unite the French and English Canadians. Quebec was originally founded by the French, and to this day is still largely more French than it is English, and they've called several times for their own independence, but have never gotten that. There's a new period of industrialization going on in Canada during this time, and they're attracting a lot of immigrants to some of the vast land that they have and some of the opportunities in industrialization. Now that we've settled and we're starting to move into industrial period, we need access to more raw materials, and this is where expansion begins. Now, imperialism was a way of controlling a country without having to man it with your own armies. So you could control a foreign territory, you could control the political infrastructure there, and what makes it easier is the development of the machine gun. Other high-powered artillery, battleships. You can control the seas, and you could also go and control the people. Normally, a show of force was enough to get them to do whatever you told them to do. This is social Darwinism on a global scale, on a national scale, and we talked a few days ago about the different types of social Darwinism. Now, a lot of the growth of the world, as far as from a economic standpoint, was based on raw materials. You needed sources of rubber, oil, bauxite, copper, and diamonds from Africa, Asia, and Latin Americas. One family really goes on to take over the majority of the diamond trade in the world, and as of 2021, they control somewhere around 93% of the world's diamonds, and that's the De Beers. They've got less than 10% of the world's supply of diamonds actually on the market to continue to drive up prices. So, for other reasons, they're moving in because there's a possibility of converting more people to Christianity, which was the goal of a lot of people. From a political standpoint, Great Britain's going to make Egypt into a protectorate. Now, a protectorate is basically when one country has its thumb on the other and forces them to do what they want, but has figureheads in charge to do their bidding. And they get to stay in charge as long as they're following the lead of the home country. Now, when the Soviets do this about 50 years later, we vilify them and call them satellite nations, which struck fear into the hearts of a lot of Americans. Because the thought of putting anything in space means that you might be able to put a nuclear bomb right above your country. So the British were able to take control of the Suez Canal. Now, there's so many people living in Europe at this time, people were terrified of overcrowding, so 30 to 50 million people are going to go and leave Europe because it's such a small territory, so densely populated. There's cultural missionaries like David Livingstone, who went to Africa as a medical missionary. He went down the Nile and found a little village to work in, and someone was sent after him to deliver some type of message, and he was presumed dead at one point, but once they actually found him, he was the only white man in the area, and they assumed it was him. They said Dr. Livingstone, I presume, which was always a famous thing whenever I grew up, and a little bit underwhelming whenever you look at what's going on here. Rudyard Kipling wrote The White Man's Burden and talked about how important what the Europeans and Americans were doing by going out to different parts of the world and civilizing them by bringing them democracy and Christianity. And it was okay to do this because, according to Herbert Spencer and his concept of social Darwinism, that it was okay for the superior people of the world to move in and basically demonstrate to the rest of the world how to live in the same manner that they did. Okay, so in 1875, only 11% of Africa was controlled by Europe. But during this time of imperialism, where they're pushing to take large pieces of land, in a 25-year span, it goes from 11% to 90% of Africa was controlled by Europeans. The Berlin Conference. Bismarck and European nations divided Africa and didn't worry about where the tribes were in Africa, and just split them down the middle. And this caused a lot of problems to this day as tribes were separated and turned into rivals against each other. And this is all in another effort just to grab whatever resources they could in Africa. Now, the Congo Free State. This was not a colony of Belgium, but actually just under the King Leopold II. And during his 44-year reign of the Congo, he had offended so many people that it was taken away from him by his country. He amassed so much wealth, but did such horrible things. He ignored all anti-slavery laws and basically did whatever he wanted there. He started stealing all the rubber and ivory from the land that he could, and worked the population so that about a tenth of the population will die off just due to the working conditions that were required by him. It also brought in European diseases, and eventually several countries are going to condemn his actions, and Belgium proper is going to take over this colony from their king and not allow him to have any control over what's going on in the country. And he will die the year after, much to the pleasure of the people in the Congo. So, Britain. So, this has to do with South Africa. So, the British colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, established a tariff union between Britain and its colonies. Britain actually will steal the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa from the Dutch in 1815. But there were problems with the Dutch settlers there. And by the way, these Dutch were not easy to get kicked out. There were only 23,000 of them, but they took a tremendous toll on an army of 120,000 British soldiers. These Dutch people were called the Boyers or the Afrikaners, and there wasn't really a way for the South Africans to win in any way whatsoever. The Zulu and the Xhosa were both massacred in large numbers by the British and the Dutch. Now, at the Battle of Omdurman, Britain fought the Sudan for its territory. And they were able to take the territory because they had the machine gun. And they lost 48 men taking over the Sudan from the Sudanese people. And the Sudanese lost 10,000. So the machine gun was that powerful of a tool. Now, Cecil Rhodes is going to found the country of Rhodesia. Wonder where we got the name Rhodesia with the last name of Rhodes. I don't know. It took a lot of effort to put a "ia" on the end of it. Anyway, they monopolized the gold and the diamond mines there. Now, the Boer War, we talked about a little bit about this on the last slide. This is in South Africa. Okay, so the British took 450,000 troops at one point to defeat 87,000 Boers, and they lost 22,000 men against these numbers. Now, the British would use concentration camps and scorched earth policies, and they destroyed food, livestock, and they put large numbers of men, women, and children into these concentration camps and starved them to death. 40,000 civilians will die in the British concentration camps, and 81% of those were children. The newspapers talked in Great Britain about the horrible abuses that were being done to the white and black populations. So it wasn't just the white or the black populations. More white people died in the camps than black people, if that's, 40,000 people and 81% of them being kids. It's horrible, regardless of who it is. And they didn't have any problem, killing anyone to go ahead and take control and put it in the state that they wanted. Now, ultimately, the Boers would govern the Transvaal and the Orange Free State within the British Empire. So they still had some ruling power in. Anyway, they still had some power in South Africa. Now, British India. When the British took over, they went and made deals with the people in charge of India, but everyone was really unhappy about the British being there in the first place. So in the Sepoy Mutiny, Hindu and Muslim soldiers, they were all Indian, and Indian from the country of India. These are not Native Americans, just to reduce or add to the confusion. I'm not sure which one I'm doing right now. Well, anyway, these Indian Hindus and Indian Muslims rebelled against the British, and the British were able to brutally and horribly put down this rebellion. But as a result of this, they would dissolve the British East India Company. But Britain contained control of India until the 1950s. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria had 14 children. Eventually, her line will take over the majority of the European countries. Everyone is related to Queen Victoria and to each other. So once we get into World War I, you'll find that a lot of first cousins were fighting against each other. She took control of India directly and ruled it as the Empress of India. And that continued for the next 100 years until Queen Elizabeth II will give up that title. They modernized India with railroads. They also brought in university educators. And this will lead to independence for India, due to the efforts of people like Mahatma Gandhi. Now, they did end the practice of the sati, where the widow would throw herself on her husband's funeral pyre. If you were, married and your husband died, you were no longer allowed as a woman to jump on top of the fire and burn to death violently. I don't know why that was ever needed. I hope that my wife, if anything happens to me, will find someone hotter than I am, and I don't mean by temperature, where she'd have to test it by jumping on the fire while I'm on fire. So, anyway, we all have our hopes and dreams, but none of them includes burning my wife. Or at least not for me. You might be messed up, and if you are, please talk to someone. Get some help. The population of India would grow at this time from 136 million to 300 million over a 40-year time period under Queen Victoria. And 2/3 of the population will really struggle with malnourishment. And that will continue to be a problem for the next 100 years. Britain doesn't do a lot to really improve the lives of the people that they rule. Unlike Americans, who don't really do anything to improve the lives of the people that they rule outside of the U.S. proper, and if you talk to many Americans, including in the United States as a whole. Now let's talk about Australia. Let's talk about Down Under. Australian gold and land for grazing sheep led to a lot of people moving to Australia. The problem was there were a lot of people that lived there that owned the land called Aborigines, or Native Australians. So their solution was to slaughter them in large numbers and take the land away from them. Eventually they will stop this practice after massacring about a quarter of the people. Now, Australia and New Zealand both will have partial self-rule by 1900. Now, I know what you've all been wondering all year. Why don't more people live in Siberia? Well, Siberia, normally the high temperature of the year is somewhere around 18 degrees. That's the high temperature of the year. During the winter, it's been known to get down to the negative 70s Fahrenheit. I know you're thinking, well, that's only 40 Celsius, negative 40 Celsius. Well, both of those suck. Now, 7 million Russians will settle in Siberia between 1800 and 1914. I guess opportunity, or, they just liked to be cold. I don't know. I can't make it make sense. The carving of China. So, the Qing dynasty, that's spelled with a Q, this let Westerners come in and kind of take advantage of what was going on in the country. Now, the Chinese wanted opium, and the British and the French supplied them with just enough opium to be able to get whatever they wanted from them from trading and other types of concessions, natural resources. And they would use drugs and gunboats to try and destroy the Chinese and take over the country. Now, eventually, in the Treaty of Nanking, China will surrender Hong Kong and give free trade to several nations through several treaties. Extraterritoriality. Okay. This allowed Europeans to follow the home laws where they were from and ignore all the laws that took place in China. Now, Italy, in an effort to become an imperial power much like Germany, Britain, and France and Africa, will make a move to try and take over Ethiopia. And it would be defeated. Now, later they would conquer Libya, but they were the first major power to be defeated in Africa. And they will bide their time, and about 30 years later they would attack with airplanes and machine guns and actually take over Ethiopia 30 years later. They wanted their revenge for having lost a battle against people that had no desire to fight them or have any interest with them at all. French Indochina was established in the 1880s. This is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And it's because of these actions by France in this part of the world that the U.S. will eventually get involved in French Indochina 100 years later in the Vietnam War. Now, while the rest of the world was focused on Africa, the U.S. is going to seize several islands in the Pacific, including the Philippines, the Samoan Islands, Hawaii, and about 10 smaller islands throughout the Pacific. Germany would also try and move into that territory, but did not have the success the United States did. This leads us to the end of yet another day. I hope everyone's doing well. Please don't cocaine. Please don't AIDS. And whatever you do, don't COVID. If you see anyone cocaining or AIDSing, tell them to stop and then go tell an adult that they should be stopping. This is Mr. Dugdale, and I will see you soon. Have a great day.